He had been awake since before the sun came up, which wasn't unusual for a man of 78 who had learned, somewhere around his 60th year, that sleep was a young person's luxury. Clifford Oakes sat at the kitchen table of his house on the edge of Trenton, Ontario, with a mug of tea he had stopped drinking 20 minutes ago, watching the birch trees at the far end of the yard catch the first grey light of a September morning. The tea had gone cold. He didn't bother to reheat it. He had a habit of making tea and then forgetting about it, which his daughter had pointed out to him on several occasions, gently, in the way she had learned to say things to him since her mother died. There was a photograph on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a maple leaf that he had never bought himself and couldn't remember receiving. In the photograph, a younger version of Clifford Oakes stood beside a CH-124 Sea King helicopter on the deck of a naval vessel somewhere in the North Atlantic, squinting into a wind that had been cold enough to make his eyes water. He was wearing his flight suit. He was 31 years old. He looked, to anyone who didn't know him, like a man who had just returned from somewhere ordinary. He had not returned from somewhere ordinary, but that was a long time ago, and Clifford Oakes was not a man who talked about the past. His neighbours knew him as the quiet fellow on Maple Ridge Road who kept his driveway cleared in winter and his lawn edged in summer, and who waved from the porch but never lingered long enough for conversation. They did not know what he had done. They did not know what he had seen. He had never told them, and he had no intention of starting now. What he did intend on this particular morning was to drive 40 minutes north to the Canadian Forces-based Trenton Air Show, where, among other things, a restored CP-140 Aurora Maritime Patrol aircraft was going to be displayed on the flight line for the first time in years. He had worked on Aurora airframes for 11 years before his retirement. He knew that aircraft the way some men know the sound of their own heartbeat, not consciously, not by thinking about it, but in a way that was simply present always, somewhere below the level of deliberate thought. He pulled on his jacket, found his cane behind the door where he always left it since the winter he had slipped on the back steps and done something to his left knee that the doctor called a partial meniscal tear and that Clifford Oakes called a nuisance, picked up his truck keys and left. The air show at CFB Trenton drew a crowd every year, and this year was no different. By 9 in the morning, the spectator area along the south side of the flight line was already thick with families, children sitting on shoulders, teenagers with their phones raised, older couples in camp chairs they had hauled in from the parking lot. There were veterans in the crowd, identifiable by the small pins on their jackets and by something less tangible, a quality of stillness they carried even in a noisy place, as though they had long since made their peace with noise and no longer needed to react to it. Clifford Oakes parked in the designated veterans lot, which was closer to the entrance than the general parking, a detail he appreciated without sentimentality. He had never been a man who sought or particularly welcomed the courtesies extended to veterans. He accepted them the way he accepted the cold. As a fact of the environment, neither welcome nor unwelcome, simply present. He made his way through the entrance gate slowly, because his knee was worse in the cold, and September in Trenton had turned sharply cold that week, and because he had learned, at 78, that there was no point in pretending otherwise. A young airman at the gate offered to get him a wheelchair, and Clifford Oakes looked at the young man for a moment with an expression that communicated, without any particular hostility, that the suggestion had been heard and declined, and the young man nodded and wished him a good morning and went back to his post. The flight line was magnificent. That was the only word for it, and Clifford Oakes, who was not given to superlatives, acknowledged it privately as he made his way along the spectator fence. The aircraft were arranged in a long row on the tarmac, a Snowbird CT-114 Tutor with its red and white livery gleaming in the thin morning sun, a vintage Lancaster bomber from the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, 2 CF-18 Hornets, a CH-147 Chinook with its rotors folded and at the far end separated slightly from the others as though it required its own space, the CP-140 Aurora. He stood in front of it for a long time. It was not the same aircraft he had worked on, of course. His Aurora had been decommissioned years ago, and he had no romantic illusions about machines. Machines were not loyal. They did not remember you. But this one had the same long, tapered fuselage, the same 4 turboprops, the same distinctive hump of the tactical compartment behind the flight deck, and looking at it brought back, with a precision that surprised him, the smell of hydraulic fluid, and the sound of the pre-flight checklist being read aloud in a voice that belonged to a man who had been dead for 12 years. He turned away from that thought. He had a habit of doing that too. The display portion of the air show began at 10 o'clock with a formation flight by the snowbirds, and the crowd reacted the way crowds always react to the snowbirds, with a kind of collective breathlessness, a falling quiet that happened without anyone deciding to be quiet. Clifford Oakes watched from near the fence, his hands in his jacket pockets, his cane planted in front of him. He did not breathe sharply or lean forward. He simply watched, with the focused attention of a man who understood what was actually happening up there, which was more complicated and more dangerous than it looked. After the snowbirds, there was a static display period during which the public was permitted, under supervision, to approach the aircraft on the flight line. Clifford Oakes had attended enough of these events to know that the supervision was variable. Some ground crew took the responsibility seriously. Others were more interested in answering questions from attractive young women who wanted to know what all the buttons did. He drifted along the flight line, stopping here and there, saying nothing, looking. He had a particular way of looking at aircraft that people sometimes noticed and couldn't quite name. It wasn't admiration, exactly, and it wasn't inspection in the official sense. It was something closer to recognition. He looked at aircraft the way a doctor looks at a patient he has treated before, searching for the familiar and alert to the unfamiliar. He had reached the CP-140 when he noticed the ground crew preparing the aircraft for its scheduled engine run demonstration. This was the event the crowd had been waiting for, or at least the crowd members who understood what an engine run was. The plan, as it had been publicized in the air show program, was for the ground crew to start all 4 engines and run them up to demonstrate the sound and power of the aircraft for the spectators. The pilot, a young squadron leader named Deschamps, whom Clifford Oakes did not know, would be at the controls. The aircraft would not, of course, move from its position. The ground crew was competent. Clifford Oakes could see that much from the way they moved around the aircraft. Purposeful, coordinated, going through their checks in the right order. The crew chief was a young master corporal named Villeneuve, maybe 26 years old, with the focused expression of someone taking a responsibility seriously. He had his checklist. He had done his walk-around. The maintenance documentation on this aircraft was, by all accounts, current and complete. Clifford Oakes watched them work, and then he saw it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something that would show up in a photograph or on a monitor or in any instrument reading. It was the way the number 3 engine cowling sat. Specifically, it was the way the lower panel of the number 3 engine cowling sat, which was off by perhaps 4 millimeters from where it should have been, and which created, if you knew what you were looking at, a particular kind of shadow line along the lower left fastener row that did not match the shadow line on the number 1 or number 2 cowlings. Clifford Oakes had worked on CP-140 Aurora aircraft for 11 years. He had written a section of the maintenance training manual that was still in use, or had been the last time he checked, which was admittedly some years ago. He had seen that exact shadow line twice before in his career. Both times it had meant the same thing. A fastener had been installed with improper torque, which had allowed the panel to shift by a very small amount, which under the vibration of engine run-up would become a larger amount, which would eventually, not always immediately, but eventually, cause the cowling to partially separate, which could introduce debris into the engine intake. He stood there for a moment with this information in his mind, the way you stand with something heavy, deciding how to set it down. He looked around for someone to tell. The ground crew chief, Master Corporal Villeneuve, was on the other side of the aircraft, speaking into a radio. A senior NCO was standing near the wing root, watching the crowd line. There were 2 maintenance technicians near the engine nacelle, who were engaged in what appeared to be a brief argument about something on the checklist. Clifford Oakes had, on 2 previous occasions in his career, been the person who stopped something from happening. He knew what it cost. He knew the way people looked at you afterward. Not with gratitude, not at first, but with the complicated expression of people who had been told they were wrong by someone they weren't expecting to be right. He knew the paperwork. He knew the explaining. He knew the particular humiliation of being correct, because being correct in those situations always meant that someone else had been incorrect, and people did not forgive you for that easily. Or He also knew that the number 3 engine was about to be run up to 60% power in front of 8,000 spectators and a pilot who was trusting his ground crew with his life. He walked around the nose of the aircraft, past the spectator rope, onto the tarmac, and headed for the number 3 engine. Master Corporal Nathan Villeneuve had been the ground crew chief for this Aurora for 14 months, and he was, by the measure of his peers and his superiors, very good at his job. He had his certifications. He had his endorsements. He had performed the walk-around on this aircraft himself that morning, beginning at 0600, and everything had been within tolerances. He had the paperwork to prove it. So when he turned from his radio conversation and saw an elderly man in a civilian jacket with a cane walking across the tarmac toward his number 3 engine, his first response was confusion, and his second response was alarm, and both of those responses arrived at approximately the same moment. "Sir," he called out, moving quickly toward the man. "Sir, this is a restricted area." The old man did not stop. "Sir, I need you to stop. You need to stay behind the rope." The old man stopped. He stopped approximately 3 meters from the number 3 engine nacelle, and he stood there with both hands on his cane and looked at the lower cowling panel with an expression that Nathan Villeneuve could not immediately categorize. It was not the expression of a confused elderly man who had wandered somewhere he shouldn't be. It was focused. It was precise. It was the expression of someone who was looking, specifically, at something specific. "Sir," Nathan said, positioning himself between the man and the aircraft, "I'm going to have to ask you to step back to the spectator area. This aircraft is preparing for engine run and—" "Your number 3 lower cowl panel," the old man said without looking at Nathan, "is sitting 4mm proud on the left side." Nathan paused. "It's within tolerance, sir. I completed the walk-around myself at—" "The fastener line," the old man said. "Bottom left, look at the shadow." Nathan looked at the fastener line on the bottom left of the number 3 engine cowling. He looked at it the way he had been trained to look at things, systematically, objectively, using the checklist criteria that had been drilled into him through 3 years of aviation technician training and 14 months of operational experience. He compared it mentally to the specification. It was within tolerance. He was nearly certain. He was also, suddenly, not entirely certain. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask your name and your credentials before we can." "Warrant Officer Clifford Oakes," the man said. "Retired. 32 years. Aurora airframes primarily, with 11 years direct on the CP-140 series." He paused. "I also wrote Chapter 7 of the Maritime Patrol Aircraft Maintenance Standards Handbook, 3rd edition, which is the section on cowling installation procedures and torque verification for the Aurora nacelle panels. The acceptable tolerance shift for that panel is 2mm, not 4. Your panel is at 4. The word retired landed somewhere in Nathan Villeneuve's chest in a complicated way. He looked at the panel again. He looked at Warrant Officer Clifford Oakes. He picked up his radio. The engine run demonstration was delayed by 40 minutes. This was announced over the PA system as a brief technical review, and the crowd received this information with the mild, good-natured grumbling that Canadian crowds bring to minor inconveniences before turning their attention to the vintage Lancaster and its own static display. During those 40 minutes, a maintenance inspection team that included the base's senior aviation systems technician, a chief warrant officer named Bergeron who had 28 years in the trade, pulled the number 3 lower cowling panel on the CP-140. What they found was a fastener, specifically fastener 16 of 32 in the lower panel row, that had been installed at 73% of specified torque rather than the required 100%. The fastener was tight enough to pass a visual inspection. It was not tight enough to maintain panel integrity under sustained engine vibration. Chief Warrant Officer Bergeron, who had seen a great many things in 28 years of maintenance work, examined the fastener, examined the installation, and then walked over to where Clifford Oakes was standing near the wingtip and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. "How did you see that from outside the rope line?" he finally said. "Shadow line on the fastener row," Clifford Oakes said. "Panels shifted just enough to change the angle." Bergeron nodded slowly. He looked back at the engine. Then he looked at Clifford Oakes's jacket, which had no insignia, no rank, no unit pin, no indication of what he was or had been. "What were you?" Bergeron asked. "Just a technician," Clifford Oakes said. Bergeron looked at him for another moment. He had been in this trade long enough to know that just a technician was sometimes the most important thing a person could be, and that the men who said it that way, without irony, without false modesty, just as a statement of fact, were often the ones who had gone deepest into the work, who had spent 30 years accumulating exactly the kind of knowledge that couldn't be written down in a checklist or captured in a certification. "You probably saved the aircraft," Bergeron said. "At minimum, aye." "No," Clifford Oakes said, without any particular drama. "That's why I walked out there." "Before we go any further, let me ask you something. How many times have you passed someone like Clifford Oakes on a street corner, in a waiting room at an event like this one, and seen only an old man with a cane moving slowly through a crowd? How many times have you assumed that the accumulation of years was a subtraction, that age had taken something from a person rather than given them something that cannot be taught?" If Clifford Oakes had been 32 years old, with a flight suit and a badge, Nathan Villeneuve would have listened immediately. We all would have. That's something worth thinking about. The engine run demonstration proceeded 90 minutes later than scheduled. The panel was re-talked, re-inspected, and signed off by Chief Warrant Officer Bergeron personally. Squadron Leader Deschamps, who had been briefed on what had happened, ran the engines up to full ground power without incident, and the crowd responded with the noise crowds make when four powerful turboprops are running at full cry, which is less a cheer than a kind of awed animal silence followed by spontaneous applause. Clifford Oakes watched from behind the rope line, where he had returned after his conversation with Bergeron. He watched the way he always watched, steadily, without expression, taking in the aircraft rather than performing any emotion about it. A woman standing next to him, perhaps 50 years old, turned and smiled at the noise, and he nodded at her in the way he had of acknowledging the world without quite joining it. He thought about Dorothy, as he often did in moments like this. Dorothy had come to his retirement ceremony at the base 20 years ago and had stood in the second row in the blue coat she'd bought specifically for the occasion, and afterwards she had taken his arm as they walked to the car and said, quite quietly, "I never really understood what you did in there, Cliff, but I always understood that it mattered." He had not known what to say to that, and so he had said nothing, and she had leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and that had been that. She had been dead for 4 years. She had never seen this air show. She had never seen the aurora on this flight line, which was just as well, because she had always found the engine noise too loud, and she had always been more interested in the people at these events than the aircraft, which was a completely different way of being in the world, but not, he had concluded over many years of thinking about it, an inferior one. He thought she would have appreciated what had happened today, not the technical part. She would not have understood or particularly cared about cowling panel torque specifications, but the other part. The part where an old man walks out to tell someone something they don't want to hear and is right, and the pilot goes home safe. That part she would have understood completely. He stayed until the afternoon flying display was finished, which was later than he had planned, and he felt it in his knee on the walk back to the parking lot. Nathan Villeneuve went home that evening to his apartment in Belleville and sat at his kitchen table and did not immediately turn on the television, which was unusual for him. He sat there with a glass of water and thought about what had happened, which was also unusual, because he was, in general, a person who processed things by not thinking about them directly. He was a good technician. He had always believed this, and the evidence of his career, his evaluations, his endorsements, his reputation on the flight line supported it. He followed procedure. He was thorough. He had done the walk-around on that aurora at 6 in the morning, and he had not seen what Clifford Oakes had seen from outside a rope barrier after a 20-minute walk from the parking lot. This was not, he understood, a failure of procedure. He had followed procedure correctly. The fastener had passed visual inspection because it was visually within the boundaries of what a visual inspection was designed to detect. The error was subtle. The tools available to him had not been sufficient to catch it. But Clifford Oakes had caught it, and what Nathan kept returning to, sitting there at his kitchen table, was the question of how, not why, not whether it mattered. Obviously it mattered. Chief Warrant Officer Bergeron had made that very clear in a brief, quiet conversation that Nathan would not soon forget. But how? How do you see a 4-millimetre panel shift from 15 metres by shadow line after a walk from a parking lot when you are 78 years old and moving with a cane? The answer, Nathan Villeneuve was beginning to understand, was not a procedure. It was not a certification or an endorsement or a number of hours logged. It was something that happened over a very long time and through a very large number of encounters with the specific way things looked when they were right, so that the specific way things looked when they were wrong became eventually simply visible. Not louder than everything else. Just visible, the way a wrong note is visible to a musician who has played the right notes enough times. He thought about his own certifications. He thought about the things they captured and the things they didn't. He thought about what it might feel like, at 78, to walk out onto a restricted tarmac with a cane and plant yourself there and say what you saw, knowing that no one was going to believe you at first and knowing anyway that you were right. He thought it must feel like the truest possible expression of 32 years of work. He thought he understood, now, why Warrant Officer Oakes had said just a technician. The incident was reviewed by the Base Safety Office, which found no systemic failures in maintenance procedure and noted that the fastener had been installed within the ambiguous zone where visual inspection alone was insufficient and torque verification would have been required for detection. The review recommended an amendment to the pre-display checklist for static demonstration engine runs, specifically requiring torque verification on all cowling fasteners within 48 hours of the event. The recommendation was accepted. In the report, the action taken by the retired warrant officer was described in the careful language of official documents as timely identification by an experienced observer that prevented potential equipment damage and ensured flight safety. The document noted that the individual had been Warrant Officer, retired CM Oakes, formerly of 14 Wing Trenton. Clifford Oakes never read the report. He was not, in any official sense, part of the process that produced it. He had given a brief statement to the safety officer, a thorough and accurate account of what he had observed and why it had concerned him, and then he had gone home. He had driven the 40 minutes back down Highway 2 with the radio off and the window cracked slightly, the way he preferred it, and he had stopped at the Tim Hortons in Frankfurt and ordered a medium tea, and he had sat at a table by the window and drunk it while it was still hot, which was different from his usual habit, and he had thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. At home he fed the cat, a large indifferent grey animal named Sergeant Major that had appeared in his yard 3 winters ago and never left, and he stood for a moment at the back window looking at the birch trees in the last of the late September light. He had a daughter in Ottawa who called every Sunday. He would not tell her about this. She would worry, and then she would be proud, and the combination of those two emotions, which was the combination she always brought to any significant thing he did, was sometimes more than he knew how to receive. He would let this one stay where it was, out there on the tarmac at CFB Trenton, in the shadow line of a fastener on a number 3 cowling panel, in the quiet 40 minutes when a young crew chief listened to an old man and the right thing happened. Some things did not need to be told to be true. He had learned that a long time ago, in places whose names he still did not speak aloud, doing work that had mattered in ways that no certificate had ever captured. He had carried it quietly ever since, through a long career and a long marriage and a long slow settling into a life on the edge of a small Ontario city, and it had not gotten lighter with the years, but he had gotten better at carrying it. Sergeant Major jumped onto the windowsill and regarded him with the complete indifference of cats. "You're right," Clifford Oakes said, to the cat, or to the trees, or to no one in particular. "Let's eat." And he went to make his dinner, moving slowly and without hurry, in the last light of the day, a man of 78 who had once again done the thing he was trained to do, and who asked nothing of the world in return except to be left in peace to do it again if it was ever needed.